What is up, tone nerds? This is Anthony from Texas Blues Alley. The subject of today's video is Stevie Ray Vaughan's tone in The Sky is Crying. Unless you were buried under a rock and somehow missed the month of October, pretty much all I did was talk about that recording because I was putting out a course. And so I had a whole bunch of videos leading up to it. And then I had a whole bunch of videos promoting the course. This is literally all I talked about. And some people noticed in the course of all those videos that my tone was different. And so I got a lot of questions. What are you using for amps and pedals, this, that, and the other thing? And so for everybody who asked, I replied, when the course is done, I'm going to put out a full breakdown. Well, this is that breakdown. So a few caveats going into it. Number one, this is going to be long. It's going to be very teachy. If you hear me say something in this video and you don't hear what I'm talking about, there could be a couple reasons for that. Number one, you might not be listening on good enough speakers or headphones. But the other part of it is that your ears just might not be developed enough to hear the nuances of what I'm talking about. Maybe you've never thought about the fact that your ears can get better, but they can, which is weird because as you get older, your hearing gets worse in terms of frequency range that you can hear, but your brain's ability to separate out different parts of what you're hearing definitely gets better. And I'm able to hear things in his tone in the song now that I just wasn't used to listening for. So you could watch this video today and say, I don't get it. I don't hear it. And then come back to it in a year and hear it completely differently. That's how drastic a change it can be. And then one last caveat. What I'm showing you today is not practical. It is not Stevie Ray Vaughan in a box. This is a highly specialized approach to getting a specific tone, and I used everything at my disposal to get it. This is not me recommending gear. I'm not telling you to go out and do this stuff. I'm simply documenting what I did and the thought processes that went into it. So, having said all that, Stevie didn't have one tone. He had many tones across his career. And of all the tones that he had, this one has an almost singular sound in terms of its mix of clean and dirty and the sizzle on the high end, and it is a tone that is only heard on a couple of his tracks. Can't think of them off the top of my head, but I'll put them on screen. And if you go and listen to those tracks very closely, I think you'll see what I mean. Because even within the rest of the songs, like The Sky is Crying was recorded during that Soul to Soul session, but it did not appear on that album. But the amps that he was using that resulted in that tone on The Sky is Crying were what he used in that session. So with that in mind, I'm going to present you kind of a high-level overview of what I was going for. The recipe that I ended up with basically consists of a Strat. In this case, it's my 90s Photo Flame Fender Strat with a set of Zex Coil Modern 5 pickups. Those are hot pickups with a lot of output. Not necessarily what you want for Stevie Ray Vaughan's tone. His pickups typically were underwound, but I just had it refretted and I wanted to use it. So that's what I used. And I'm going to split it into two paths. And each path is going to have its own effects, amp and cabinet. And then I'm going to combine those two signals and apply effects to them. So let's step into the first leg of this chain, and that is two tube screamers into a cranked Fender amp. There's something that happens when you have two tube screamers stacked into each other. The last one in the chain is kind of like the master volume. So you want that one set just to boost the volume a little bit. And then whatever you put the volume to the one feeding that just pushes that one a little bit harder. In terms of tone, what I found is that if I took the first tube screamer, low gain, kind of medium output, and then treble maxed, that would produce a tone that was really bright and cuts through. And then the second one, low gain, a little bit more of a volume boost, but then the tone rolled back, that would just take the teeth off of the signal a little bit. And then for the amp, I decided to use my late 60s, maybe 1970 Dual Showman Reverb. It's, one of the better sounding old Fender amps that I have. So in order to have the most portability and predictability possible, I decided to capture this whole setup here, the 2 tube screamers and the Dual Showman Reverb. I captured that into a profile without a cabinet. I had the Dual Showman set up over here. I was using my Fryette power station. Putting that in the middle gives me the opportunity to access the sound of the amp without the cabinet. And that's important. I'll talk about that more as we get into it. So typically when you create a profile in a Kemper Profiler, you have your amp and your cabinet, and you have a microphone on the cabinet. And you're basically capturing a profile of that whole system so that your Kemper has that entire sound. I expanded the profile back to include the effects, but I cut out the cabinet. So basically, your profiler feeds into your signal chain and then captures the output and then creates like a little black box of whatever's in there. In this case, my profiler was feeding the effects and recording the output after the amp, but before the cabinet. I'll explain why in a second. What I captured into the profiler was the sound of 2 tube screamers feeding my Fender Dual Showman Reverb, and that profile sounds like this. Couple things, if you've never heard a tube amp or any other kind of amp minus a speaker, it sounds a little weird. So that's how I took care of this part of the equation. That was 100% repeatable. I could plug in any time of day, no matter what the weather is, and I could get the sound of those 2 tube screamers and that Fender amp in a box, essentially, perfectly repeatable. Now, what comes next is cabinet impulse responses. I want you to listen real closely here. Notice that does not sound a lot like a guitar. You can tell, even if you've not mic'd your own guitar amps, you can tell it sounds different. But watch what happens as I apply EQ. A guitar speaker is not a full range speaker. It produces sound that cuts off at a certain frequency, and it might cut some of the lows. It is essentially a living, breathing equalizer for the sound coming out of your amp. The overall function that it provides is this is the dumbest representation of what a speaker does. Is it applies an EQ curve to your sound. So when you capture an impulse response of a speaker in a cabinet, it's basically using some calculus to compute an EQ curve of what that speaker does at every frequency. So given some input, the impulse response of that speaker in that cabinet will basically modify the sound the same way that a specific microphone in front of a specific speaker would have modified that sound. So here's the crazy thing. You could move the microphone an inch to the left, an inch to the right, an inch front, an inch back, and the response curve can be wildly different. So this is the beauty of using impulse responses when you're recording, because you can buy impulse response packs for speakers that you will never have access to, and they will have hundreds of impulse responses for microphones that you'll never be able to afford. And if you capture your amp direct into the computer so it sounds like this, you can then pass it through 1, 2, up to, in the software I'm going to show you, up to 8 different impulse responses, which each correspond to a different mic in a different position on a different speaker, and it can combine all of them together and have a result that is pretty much identical to what you would get if you were recording through those mics and those speakers live. Let me just stop talking and let me show you what I'm talking about. So I'm going to open up a plugin here called Cabinetron, and big complicated name is from a company called 3 Body Tech. And basically what it allows me to do is to combine a bunch of different impulse responses. Over here on the left, I have libraries of hundreds of impulse responses from a lot of the top companies. And so what I came up with was, and I'm not saying that this is the perfect combination of IRs. I'm not saying it's the ideal. This is just, when you're a tone nerd, you're never happy with anything. You just have to give up optimizing at some point because you need to get something done. So what you're seeing on screen here, these are EVM 12Ls in a Music Man cabinet. EVM 12Ls are some people consider one of the best speakers of all time. D130 is a JBL. These are all from different companies. And then this one is an EVM 12S, which is a little bit different than a 12L. And so the resulting sounds like this. Turn down the music a little bit. Couple things going on here. Let's isolate these IRs and add them in one at a time. So, EVM 12L mic'd in the back with a 421. Balanced out with a 57 and a 121 microphone in the front. So this is an IR that's pre-mixed. It's an IR made from a combination of microphones. That's what we got so far. Now, this knob is one of the unique features of Cabinetron that I like, that allows you to simulate the effects of turning a microphone from straight on to off axis. Look at it's at 59% now. Let me turn it down. Look at what's happening. I'm pointing at the screen like you see. Look at what's happening in the upper range here. Typically, when you take a microphone from being straight on to being off axis, it lowers the response in some frequencies and allows more high harmonics to kind of poke through. And if we just isolated this impulse response here, let's go back to the beginning here. Hear how it gets a little brighter? All right, let's add in the D130. Okay, makes it a little darker. Now let's add the EVM 12S rear mic. And that adds a little bit of thickness there. Now, let's talk about these phase knobs, because if I did the auto phase align, you would notice what I get. This is where the software determines where these things are supposed to be lined up so that they're all in phase. I get something that's like this. And I don't care for that. One of the things that I realized as I was really examining Stevie's tone in this song is that at this point, I'm about 90% sure that part of what makes that tone great is that some of the microphones on different amps were out of phase with each other. So if you have two microphones on the same cabinet, they should be the same distance away from the speaker to make sure they're in phase. When you get two microphones on different cabinets, the more microphones on the more cabinets you have, the more hard it gets to keep them in phase with each other. And I have a strong suspicion that when Stevie was back at the console messing with faders, pushing different combinations of mics and amps and cabinets, he discovered a combination where there was a little bit of phase cancellation in the high end, and it just made it sing. And so because I suspected that, that's when I started messing around with a phase in here. So listen. So I was trying to get a certain kind of whistle in the tone. This is what I ended up with for the first leg of the tone. And that takes us to the other leg of the chain. Last year at some point, Mixwave, I think it was last year, released a plugin based on the 2-Rock Boomfield drive, which obviously is derived a little bit from the Dumble vein of amplifiers. This second track, when I recorded the guitar, the Kemper has a direct output as well as a processed output. So it's essentially allowing you to record the Kemper and a direct guitar track. And so I always do that now so that I have a flexibility. So what I have here is just a direct dry guitar track. Let's open up the Mixwave plugin. And this plugin is unlike any other guitar plugin I've ever used. Let's just go through a couple of for one thing, I don't know what other plugins do that this one doesn't, but this thing will just blast out as much signal as you put into it. And so it seems to have a lot more headroom in terms of how loud it will go at its maximum. So you got to be really careful with it. Let me just load up the plugin settings that I ended up using. So the plugin has all the controls, you know. You have an amp. Okay. It also has built-in cabinet simulation. And so I spent a lot of time just trying to get a sound that meshed well with the sound of the Fender. So this is just what I ended up with. Let me get back to my original settings here. They don't give you the option to do multiple effects in here. I could have gotten an overdriven sound with just the amp, but it ended up being a little bit too thin. So this is just what I ended up going with. Now let's just compare that. So this is the 2-tube screamers into the Fender. When I tell you that these, I can't say they are very different tones, but they are different in some very important ways. This one is a little bit more solid in terms of not being completely overdriven, and the sound of the treble is just different. But I want to focus on what happens during those kind of sequences. Listen to how full and rich this sounds compared to the Fender. It's not even a comparison. In the treble, they might have some similarities, but in the low end, I'm getting a nice fat, low mid-range sound with this. Now let's put them together. Let me play this whole sequence. So right now it feels like the 2-rock sound is dominating, so I'm going to pull that down a little bit. And it comes together in a way that's starting to sound like a little bit of something. And so now that brings me to the final step, which is I'm going to apply some effects to the combination of these two signals. The first effect is going to be pan. And you might be thinking, well, pan is not much of an effect, but just wait until you hear this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to route both of my guitar tracks through an auxiliary bus. I'm going to make it a stereo bus, so that basically allows me to build a series of effects that apply to just the two guitar tracks before mixing it in with the music. I'm going to pan the Fender a little bit left, and I'm going to pan the 2-rock a little bit right, and listen to this. Now let me pan them back to center. Let me pan them back apart again. So, if you're listening on a good pair of headphones or some good speakers, you're probably hearing a little bit of a chorusing effect. And the reason for that is that the Fender side maintains a very consistent volume because of how compressed everything is. Everything's overdriven. Overdriven tones are more compressed. The quiet and loud, it all gets crunched down to one volume level. Whereas the Boomfield side is less overdriven, and there's a whole lot more low end when I play notes low on the guitar. So this part here, that's all high notes on the guitar. So let's assume that the level of the high is similar. But listen right here. When I go do, 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 those low notes jump out of the Boomfield plugin in a way that they don't with the Fender because of what I said before. Everything's overdriven, and the Fender amps with two tube screamers, it's going to be thin. So what happens here is that when I separate these out, you get two somewhat similar, but a little bit different trebly sounds. But then when I kick in with the walk-ups there, all of a sudden you get bursts of more sound from the Boomfield side, and it creates a little bit of a back and forth chorusing effect. And so it really starts to settle in on the G string down, G, D, A, and E string. So that was the first effect that I used, was just panning them a little bit to the right and left. The next one, actually, I'm going to skip EQ because that's a little bit of a secret. We're going to go on to chorus. I'm going to take this auxiliary bus and I'm going to route it through another auxiliary bus. And on that auxiliary bus, I'm going to put a Universal Audio Studio D chorus. This is a secret that Stevie used in the studio. Sometimes he'd route his stuff through a chorus unit. This is the sound of that chorus. I don't know what buttons he used. I'm just going to pick something. I don't want anything too crazy. Simply Nice D. That's a name for a preset. So I just have a little bit of chorus here. Let's solo the guitar. And chorus. Let me mix in a little chorus here. Very subtle, but it is an effect that he used on this recording and plenty of others. So that's part of the equation. I'm also going to do reverb here. Take this and put it through another bus, and I'm going to put on the Isotope Aurora reverb plugin. And I like this one because it has what's called a ducking feature. First of all, we want all the reverb. If we do this ducking, or what they call reveal, it basically masks the reverb a little bit to allow your unprocessed tone to come through a little bit. Let me just load up the preset that I came up with. I have no idea what reverb he used. That was kind of secondary to my concern. But if I put them together, there's the guitar. Add in a little reverb. Add in a little chorus. A little too much chorus. So, it might sound like we're getting close. All I know is that whenever I got to this step, there was something that was missing, and I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. And that is when I started using what is called a EQ matching. I am going to put an EQ plugin on here. And what I would do, I would get my tone exactly the way I wanted it or what I thought. Then I would use this plugin to compare it to the sound of the guitar. I isolated the guitar from the original recording. And I would do an EQ match between them. And the curve would change based on what my tone was. His tone wasn't changing because it's from the album. But based on what my tone was, it would try and compute what EQ curve do I need to match this to the sound of that. No matter what I did, there were 3 things that showed up in every tone matching curve that I did. The first thing was that there was a somewhat narrow peak somewhere above 6,000 hertz. There was a somewhat narrow valley right before it, and a somewhat narrow valley right after it. This is just, I'm going to show you the full thing in a minute. No matter what else was going on in the low mid-range, the lows and the mid-range or whatever, as far as this plugin was concerned, this series of boosts and cuts was always the missing ingredient between my tone, whatever I used to get my tone, and his recording on that album. And after a while, I started to wonder, maybe I should stop trying to figure out how to get rid of this by modifying my gear and just accept I'm going to need this EQ curve to really nail this tone. So that's when I came up with this right here. I'm going to bypass it and play. Listen to this. Do you hear it? Off. On. Off. On. This frustratingly simple EQ curve, it's not simple, but it's frustrating to me that this series of boosts and cuts could be so responsible for that tone. I don't know what happened in the recording sessions for this to be possible. What this means is that in order to get, and like I said, no matter what I did to get to my guitar tone, when I compared it to his tone using the EQ match, some version of this was always there. A really big peak at around 6,300 hertz, a cut around 3,700 hertz, and another cut around 11,000 hertz. And then the EQ curve would get more complicated than this, but this is the simplest version of what I could reduce it down to. So let's explore what happens when I start messing around with this. Let's take this, bring that down. Back up. You hear how the tone starts to kind of have that whistle in it? It is so ridiculously effective at nailing that part of the tone. I almost can't believe it. But if we take this and this out of the equation, it's not quite the same. We have to have that cut and that cut right there. This is kind of like a comb filtering setup going on. So here's the kind of nerdier details about these. I have the slope of these set to 24 decibels per octave, which is how fast the EQ boost rolls off. If I set this to the default of 12, it completely changes how this looks. I'm going to put this back to 24 and it creates like a wider plateau. And then the Q, you can fool around with it. If you get it too wide, it loses that something. And if it gets too narrow, it doesn't have enough. But if you get that width, that plateau just right, and then same with these things here. Let's isolate that band right there. That's the sound of what we're cutting. If we make that wide, too wide, now we're cutting out too much good stuff. You get that just right. I don't know. And then we go right here. There's not much going on right here. But if we make this one too wide, this is more or less just determining how much of the upper end of what's amplified by this boost is allowed through. And then this low cut here, or this low slope, basically just, if I push that all the way to the end, it definitely makes things too bright. So we pull that back. And the result is a tone that whistles where it's supposed to whistle. It allows just enough of the higher harmonics through, but keeps like a blanket over everything. And so then if I try and balance out the level here with the music, the only thing that's left is to put on some multi-band compression. I'm just going to and then let's put on a limiter. Maybe a little more reverb. Nope, I forgot one last step, and that is to run everything guitar related through a compressor, and I'm going to use the Universal Audio LA3. I need to mention here, I'm not a professional producer. I can get good results for my courses. I would never tell somebody that I can record or mix their album. So none of what I'm doing here is stuff that I'm telling you, you should listen to me because I know what I'm doing. This is just understand who you're dealing with here. So what you're hearing here might not match up exactly with what I had on my course, but it's very, very close because this is the exact process that I used, the exact plugins that I used. So just to review here, 2 primary tones, an overdriven Fender amp with 2 tube screamers, a Dumble style amp that's a little bit pushed, but is fatter and has a slightly different high-end profile, using cabinet IRs on the first one to get kind of a out of phasey type tone, mixing them together, splitting them apart with pan, applying this crazy EQ curve to the whole thing, mixing in a little bit of chorus, mixing in a little bit of reverb, and this is what we got. Now, you can certainly nitpick and say that this isn't the same as this particular phrase or that particular phrase. As far as I'm concerned, this was close enough for me to put out for the course. Compared to, but this EQ curve, if I took this out of the equation, I mean, it's perfectly good tone, but this is as close to a secret ingredient as anything I've ever discovered in all my years of recording guitars. And it almost feels like cheating. Once I started using this EQ curve, I could not. Well, it helps that I was doing all videos related to this song. But just know that if you ever hear me on a video again where I have the guitar and it kind of squeals like that, it's this. It's like magic. So anyway, I don't know if a good way to close this video. That's how I went about trying to build a Stevie Ray Vaughan tone, similar to what he played in The Sky Is Crying. It's a convoluted way using all the tools I have at my disposal. It's not something that I could just put in a preset and give to you. It is what it is. I hope you learned something from this video. If I bored you, I tried to warn you ahead of time what it was going to be. That's it. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day.